The poor, abandoned husband stood in the lawyer's office 72 hours after his wife divorced him to marry his best friend. But what the attorney revealed about the $450 billion real estate empire he'd just inherited made his hands tremble with a power he'd never imagined possessing. His wife had walked away from their 12-year marriage, believing she was leaving behind a struggling maintenance worker with nothing but lint in his pockets and broken dreams in his eyes. But she had no idea that the mysterious benefactor who'd been watching him since childhood had passed away the same week she signed those divorce papers. The real estate empire stretched across 47 countries with properties that housed presidents, billionaires, and royalty. But the inheritance came with documentation that revealed his best friend had been planning the betrayal for 3 years while secretly accumulating debts that would soon crush him. What he did in the next 30 days didn't just shock his ex-wife and his former best friend. It made her fall to her knees in the parking lot of the luxury penthouse she thought she'd secured forever. But by then, the revenge he'd orchestrated had already destroyed everything she thought she'd gained. Would the poor, abandoned husband show mercy to the woman who'd thrown away their marriage for money she'd never actually touch? Or would the $450 billion real estate empire become the weapon that made her regret forever the day she chose betrayal over loyalty? Daniel Matthews had always known poverty the way some people know languages, intimately, fluently, without need for translation. The 42-year-old maintenance worker lived in a one-bedroom apartment where the faucets dripped symphonies of failure, and the heating worked only on days warm enough not to need it. But for 12 years, his wife, Jennifer, had promised him that love mattered more than money. That promise, he discovered on a rainy October evening, had an expiration date that coincided exactly with the moment his childhood best friend, Trevor Banks, had offered her something Daniel never could: the illusion of escape from the poverty that clung to their marriage like smoke to curtains. The divorce papers arrived by courier on a Tuesday morning while Daniel was repairing a broken toilet in Unit 3B of the decrepit apartment complex where he worked. But the letterhead came from a law firm whose hourly rates exceeded his monthly salary. Jennifer hadn't even bothered to tell him in person that she was ending their marriage. But the clinical language of the legal document communicated what 12 years of shared struggles apparently couldn't: that she had found someone better, someone richer, someone who wasn't him. The papers specifically mentioned Trevor Banks as a relevant party to the proceedings, but Daniel's brain had refused to process that detail until he read the sentence 3 times, each reading confirming the betrayal that his heart had sensed but his loyalty had denied. Trevor had been more than a friend. He'd been the brother Daniel never had, the best man at his wedding, the person who'd lent him money when the electricity was about to be shut off. But apparently those loans had been investments in a longer game Daniel hadn't known they were playing. The documentation showed that Jennifer and Trevor had been involved romantically for at least 18 months, but the timeline suggested the planning had begun much earlier, back when Trevor had started his job at Westridge Financial, and Jennifer had started complaining that Daniel's paycheck was suffocating her potential. The affair had been conducted in restaurants Daniel couldn't afford, hotels his maintenance salary couldn't imagine, and vacation destinations his wife had claimed were work conferences for the retail job she'd recently quit without telling him. Daniel had signed the divorce papers in the lobby of his apartment building because he couldn't afford to take time off work to visit the lawyer's office, but his hand had shaken so violently that his signature looked like the lie detector reading of a guilty man. The building manager, Mrs. Chen, had watched him from behind her desk with eyes that held more pity than Daniel could stand. But she'd said nothing because what words exist for a man watching his entire life dissolve on documents that cost more to file than he earned in a month? The courier had waited with practiced patience, immune to the human drama unfolding in front of him. But Daniel noticed the man checking his watch twice, as if heartbreak operated on a schedule that couldn't accommodate delay. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday, exactly 72 hours after Daniel had signed away 12 years of marriage. But the speed of the proceedings suggested that Jennifer and her expensive lawyers had been preparing for months. Daniel had gone to the courthouse alone because he couldn't afford legal representation, but he'd worn his only suit, a threadbare garment from his wedding day, that now hung on his thinner frame like a reminder of better times that hadn't actually been better at all. Jennifer had arrived with Trevor, both of them dressed in clothes that screamed new money and fresh starts, but the way she'd avoided Daniel's eyes suggested that some part of her still remembered when they'd been happy, or at least when she'd been better at pretending. The judge had processed their divorce with the enthusiasm of someone approving a parking permit, but the finality of the gavel's strike had sent a physical pain through Daniel's chest that felt like his ribs were collapsing inward. Jennifer had walked out of the courtroom clutching Trevor's arm, her laughter echoing in the marble hallway like the soundtrack to Daniel's humiliation. But Trevor had glanced back once with an expression Daniel couldn't quite identify. Triumph mixed with something that might have been guilt if guilt were a luxury Trevor's ambition could afford. Daniel had remained in the courtroom for 20 minutes after everyone else had left, but the bailiff eventually asked him to leave because another case was scheduled, and the legal system didn't pause for grief. The letter from Whitmore and Associates arrived the next morning, but Daniel almost threw it away because it looked like another bill he couldn't pay from a creditor he'd never heard of. The envelope was cream-colored, heavy, with letterhead embossed so deeply that Daniel could feel the letters with his fingertips, but the return address listed a law firm in Manhattan that specialized in estate planning and wealth management, services that existed in a universe parallel to his own. He'd opened it while eating his breakfast of day-old donuts from the convenience store, where the clerk always gave him the ones about to be thrown away, but the first sentence of the letter made him choke on artificial cream filling. "We regret to inform you of the passing of your great-uncle, Harrison Blackwell, and are writing to inform you that you are the sole beneficiary of his estate." Daniel had never heard the name Harrison Blackwell, but the letter explained that his maternal grandmother had a brother who'd left Chicago in 1957 to pursue business opportunities overseas and had never returned. Harrison had built a real estate empire across 6 continents while maintaining complete silence about his family connections, but a private investigator hired in the 1980s had located Daniel's mother and later Daniel himself. The letter stated that Harrison had monitored your circumstances from a distance for 37 years, but had insisted on non-interference until his death, which had occurred 3 weeks earlier at the age of 94 in his estate in Monaco. The lawyer, Catherine Whitmore, requested Daniel's immediate presence in her Manhattan office to discuss matters of substantial financial significance. But the phrase felt like a foreign language to a man whose most substantial financial decision was choosing between paying rent or electricity. Daniel had called the number listed in the letter from the payphone outside his apartment building because his cell service had been disconnected 2 weeks earlier, but the receptionist who answered spoke with an accent that suggested private schools and inherited privilege. She'd confirmed his appointment for the following Monday at 2 p.m., but when Daniel explained he'd need to take the bus because he couldn't afford train fare, there'd been a pause before she'd offered to send a car service. Daniel had declined out of pride, but after hanging up, he'd stood in the cold November air, wondering if pride was something only poor people insisted on maintaining, when accepting help would be more practical. The bus ride to Manhattan took 3 hours because Daniel couldn't afford the express route, but the time gave him space to process the impossibility of what the letter suggested. He'd grown up in foster care after his mother died when he was 8, but the social workers had never mentioned any family watching from a distance or great-uncles monitoring his circumstances. The idea that someone wealthy had known about his childhood in state facilities, his years bouncing between foster homes, his struggles to finish community college while working 3 jobs, and had done nothing, filled Daniel with an anger that competed with his curiosity about what this inheritance actually meant. Catherine Whitmore's office occupied the entire 47th floor of a building in Midtown Manhattan, where even the elevator smelled like money. But the receptionist who greeted Daniel looked at his worn work jacket with an expression that suggested he'd tracked poverty across her pristine marble floors. She'd directed him to a conference room where floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of a city Daniel had visited perhaps 5 times in his entire life. But the landscape of wealth visible from this height bore no resemblance to the New York he knew from bus station bathrooms and cheap pizza consumed on street corners. Catherine Whitmore entered 17 minutes later, her appearance suggesting she'd never experienced a problem that money couldn't solve. But her eyes held a professional warmth that seemed genuine despite the vast economic gulf between her life and his. "Mr. Matthews," she'd begun, setting down a leather portfolio that probably cost more than Daniel's monthly rent. "What I'm about to tell you will fundamentally alter every aspect of your existence. But I need you to understand that your great-uncle Harrison was very specific about how this information should be delivered." She'd opened the portfolio to reveal documents with letterhead from banks Daniel had only seen in movies, but the numbers listed next to his name looked less like financial statements and more like telephone numbers for countries with long-distance codes. The real estate empire Harrison Blackwell had built encompassed 4,147 properties across 47 countries. But these weren't modest investments or middle-class rental units. They were landmark buildings, luxury hotels, commercial complexes, and residential towers in the most expensive cities on Earth. Harrison owned 60% of a building in Dubai, where the cheapest apartment sold for $12 million, but he also owned entire blocks in London, Paris, Singapore, and Sydney, where property values had increased by 4,000% since his initial purchases in the 1960s and 1970s. The portfolio included the hotel where Daniel and Jennifer had spent their wedding night, a detail that Catherine mentioned specifically because Harrison had apparently known and had found it poetically significant. "The total estimated value of the estate," Catherine had said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing, "is approximately $450 billion, but that figure fluctuates based on daily property valuations across multiple markets." Daniel had stopped breathing at billion, but Catherine had continued as if she regularly informed maintenance workers that they were suddenly wealthier than most sovereign nations. The inheritance included not just the properties themselves, but the management companies that operated them, the development firms that built them, and the investment funds that financed them, creating a self-sustaining economic ecosystem that generated approximately $3.7 billion in annual revenue. Daniel's hands had started trembling when Catherine showed him the property list, but the shaking intensified when he saw addresses he recognized. The luxury apartment building downtown where Trevor and Jennifer had moved in together after the wedding, the office tower where Trevor worked, the exclusive shopping district where Jennifer had claimed she was just browsing on weekends. She'd later discovered she was meeting Trevor. Harrison Blackwell had owned significant real estate in Daniel's own neighborhood, but the maintenance worker who'd been scrubbing toilets and unclogging drains had been doing so in buildings that his own bloodline controlled. "Your great-uncle left extensive notes explaining his philosophy," Catherine had continued, sliding a leather-bound journal across the table. "But the summary is that he wanted you to understand poverty before you understood power." The journal, written in shaky handwriting that deteriorated across its pages as Harrison's health declined, detailed a surveillance operation that had lasted 37 years. Harrison had known about every foster home, every struggle, every humiliation, but his instructions to his investigators had been clear: observe, document, but never interfere. He wanted you to develop character forged in hardship, Catherine explained, because he'd seen too many inheritances destroy recipients who hadn't earned their wealth through suffering. The journal's most recent entries, dated just days before Harrison's death, focused extensively on Daniel's marriage to Jennifer and friendship with Trevor, but the observations suggested Harrison had been having both of them investigated independently. The entry from 3 years ago noted, Trevor Banks approached Jennifer Martinez, her maiden name, at a charity function hosted at my property in San Francisco. Subsequent investigation reveals he researched her marriage to Daniel beforehand. The approach was calculated, not coincidental. The detail hit Daniel like physical violence, but Catherine had anticipated his reaction and already had tissue boxes positioned within reach. Your great-uncle documented that Trevor Banks has been accumulating significant personal debt over the past 18 months, Catherine had continued, producing another file, including loans from unsavory lenders to maintain an appearance of wealth he doesn't actually possess. The investigation showed that Trevor's job at Westridge Financial paid well but not well enough to support the lifestyle he'd been advertising, but the desperation to appear successful had led him to borrow from sources that charged interest rates that would eventually consume everything he claimed to own. Harrison believed that Trevor targeted your wife specifically because ending your marriage would psychologically devastate you at a moment when you were, according to his notes, finally developing the emotional resilience necessary to wield extraordinary power. The most devastating document in Catherine's portfolio was a series of photographs showing Jennifer and Trevor at restaurants, hotels, and vacation destinations over the past 3 years, but each image included a timestamp and location that corresponded exactly to dates when Jennifer had told Daniel she was working late or visiting her sister. Harrison's investigators had documented 147 separate encounters, but they'd also recorded conversations. Legally, Catherine assured him, using directional microphones in public spaces where Jennifer had mocked Daniel's poverty, complained about his lack of ambition, and laughed about his inability to satisfy her in any meaningful way. The recordings existed on a USB drive that Catherine offered but didn't force upon him, but Daniel had taken it because he needed to know the full truth of how completely he'd been betrayed. The inheritance comes with several conditions, Catherine had explained, producing documents that required his signature, but the most significant is a 90-day secrecy requirement. Daniel couldn't tell anyone about his new circumstances for 3 months, while the estate's legal transfer was finalized, but this period also served a strategic purpose that Harrison had outlined in his instructions. He wanted you to observe how people treated you when they believed you were still poor, Catherine had said, because those 3 months would reveal character in ways that wealth makes impossible to detect. Harrison had specifically instructed that Daniel should continue working his maintenance job, living in his apartment and maintaining his normal routine while quietly acquiring complete information about his betrayer's current circumstances. The documents Daniel signed that afternoon transferred legal ownership of $450 billion in assets, but the physical act of writing his name felt surreal, like signing autographs in someone else's dream. Catherine had assigned him a team of 12 lawyers, 8 financial advisors, and a personal security detail that would remain invisible but constant. But the contrast between this support system and the isolation he'd felt signing divorce papers 3 days earlier created a cognitive dissonance that made him question whether this meeting was actually happening. The account information she provided showed balances that included so many zeros that Daniel's brain couldn't process them as actual money. But the platinum card she handed him had a limit she described as essentially theoretical. You cannot spend enough to reach it. Your great-uncle's final instruction, Catherine had said as their meeting concluded, was that you should remember that revenge is most effective when it's educational, But education is most effective when it permanently alters the student's understanding of their place in the world. She'd explained that Harrison had been betrayed by business partners in his youth, but his response had been to systematically acquire their companies and transform their greed into cautionary tales that business schools still studied. He didn't just defeat them, Catherine had noted, he made them understand that their betrayal had elevated him to a level where their entire existence became a footnote in his success. Daniel had left Catherine's office as the sun was setting over Manhattan, but the city that had always seemed intimidating now looked different, not because the buildings had changed, but because he suddenly understood that he owned significant portions of the skyline. The doorman who'd sneered at his appearance when he'd arrived now held the door with professional courtesy, but Daniel wondered if the man had received a subtle signal from Catherine's office, or if Daniel's own bearing had somehow shifted in the hours since learning he controlled more wealth than most nations. The bus ride home felt different too, but not because the seats were any less uncomfortable. It was because every person around him existed in a reality where Daniel was still poor, but he alone knew that reality was now a performance he was choosing to continue. The 90 days of mandated secrecy transformed Daniel's life into an anthropological study of human behavior under false assumptions. But the observations he made during those 3 months would shape every decision he'd make about how to wield his new power. He'd returned to his maintenance job the morning after meeting with Catherine Whitmore, but the act of unclogging toilets and repairing broken fixtures now carried a surreal quality, like a king performing peasant tasks to remember where he'd come from, except Daniel had never been a king before and still wasn't entirely sure he wasn't experiencing an elaborate delusion. Jennifer had texted him on day 4 of his secret wealth, but the message's tone made clear she considered their chapter permanently closed. Trevor and I are hosting a housewarming party this Saturday at our new place. Obviously, you're not invited, but I'm notifying you as a courtesy since we have mutual friends who will be there. Please, don't try to contact me again. The address she'd listed was the luxury apartment building Daniel now knew he owned. But the irony of his ex-wife hosting a party to celebrate her new life in a building controlled by the man she'd abandoned created a dark humor that helped him cope with the emotional devastation that still ambushed him in quiet moments. Daniel had used the resources Catherine provided to have his investigative team compile detailed dossiers on both Jennifer and Trevor, but the information they uncovered revealed a situation even more complex than Harrison's initial surveillance had suggested. Trevor's debt situation had deteriorated significantly in the 2 months since Daniel's inheritance, but Trevor had been hiding this from Jennifer with elaborate deceptions that included fake bank statements and fabricated work bonuses. The apartment where they now lived required a monthly rent of $18,000. But Trevor had only paid the first month, and the building's management company, now ultimately answering to Daniel, had documented multiple bounced checks and excuses about temporary banking issues. Jennifer's employment situation was equally precarious but self-inflicted, the investigators revealed, because she'd quit her retail management job 2 weeks before the divorce became final, apparently believing Trevor's wealth would support them both. She'd been spending her days at luxury spas and designer stores charging purchases to credit cards that Trevor had opened in her name without her knowledge. But those cards were approaching their limits with payment due dates that would soon reveal the fiction of Trevor's financial stability. The investigators' report included a particularly devastating observation. Subject Jennifer appears genuinely unaware of her actual economic situation and continues to plan expensive renovations to the apartment and a destination wedding ceremony despite subject's Trevor's complete inability to fund either. Daniel had watched Jennifer and Trevor from a distance during those 90 days, but the observations weren't motivated by longing for what he'd lost. They were intelligence gathering for a response he was carefully architecting. He'd seen them at restaurants where they'd ordered expensive bottles of wine that Trevor studied the menu price for before approving, at charity events where they'd posed for photographs radiating success while Trevor's smile showed strain around the edges, and at the country club where their membership, Daniel's team discovered, was being paid for by a loan Trevor had taken from a criminal organization that specialized in predatory lending to desperate people trying to maintain appearances. The most revealing observation came on day 47, when Daniel saw Jennifer at a coffee shop near the luxury apartment building, sitting with 3 friends who were congratulating her on escaping poverty and, finally, living the life you deserve. Daniel had been standing in line behind them in his maintenance uniform, effectively invisible to people who didn't notice service workers, but Jennifer's voice had carried clearly, "I wasted 12 years on a man with no ambition and no future. Trevor showed me what life could be when you're with someone who actually wants success. Daniel couldn't even afford to take me to nice restaurants. Trevor took me to Paris for our honeymoon." The friends had all agreed she'd made the right choice, but none of them knew that Paris had been a weekend at a New Jersey hotel with Eiffel Tower decor, and that the honeymoon had been funded by a credit card that Trevor had no means to repay. Daniel's research team had also investigated the mutual friends Jennifer had mentioned in her text, discovering that most had taken sides in the divorce with Trevor, and Jennifer emerging as the sympathetic parties, but the narrative they'd constructed bore no resemblance to reality. According to the gossip Catherine's team had monitored, Daniel had been emotionally abusive, financially incompetent, and holding Jennifer back from her potential. But these characterizations came directly from statements Trevor had been making at their workplace and social gatherings. Trevor had positioned himself as Jennifer's rescuer rather than her affair partner, but the fiction had been so skillfully constructed that even people who'd known Daniel for years had begun to believe it. The systematic nature of the character assassination suggested that Trevor had been planning his strategy for much longer than 3 years, but the investigators traced the origin point back even further, to their college days when Trevor had dropped out due to academic failures while Daniel had graduated with honors. The resentment had been gestating for 2 decades, but it had found its perfect expression in destroying Daniel's marriage, while simultaneously acquiring the wife as a trophy proving Trevor's superiority. Catherine had summarized it in a meeting during day 63. Trevor Banks didn't fall in love with your wife. He fell in love with the idea of taking something precious from you as revenge for being the person he'd failed to become. Daniel had spent portions of his 90-day observation period reading Harrison's journals more thoroughly, discovering a philosopher hidden within the ruthless businessman, but the wisdom contained in those pages suggested his great-uncle had spent his later years trying to articulate lessons learned through 7 decades of building and wielding power. One entry from 5 years earlier had been marked with a red tab, indicating Harrison intended it as particularly important. True power isn't measured in dollars or properties. It's measured in the distance between what people think they know and what reality actually contains. The person who controls that gap controls everything. Another journal entry, dated 3 years before Harrison's death, addressed Daniel directly, suggesting Harrison knew his health was declining and wanted to communicate across time. Daniel, if you're reading this, I'm gone, but my absence has given you what my presence never could. The ability to see betrayal coming and the resources to transform it into education. The people who hurt you when they believed you were powerless have given you the greatest gift, certainty about their character. What you do with that certainty will define whether you become a person of wisdom or simply another wealthy fool using money as a weapon. The security team Catherine had assigned to Daniel reported weekly on his activities, but their job wasn't to restrict his freedom. It was to ensure his physical safety while he still appeared poor and potentially vulnerable. Their reports, which Catherine shared with him during their monthly meetings, revealed details about his own life that Daniel hadn't consciously noticed. That Mrs. Chen, his building manager, had been giving him grocery gift cards disguised as tenant appreciation bonuses, that the convenience store clerk had been holding day-old donuts specifically for him rather than actually throwing them away, and that 3 of his maintenance co-workers had been secretly covering for him on days when his depression made working difficult. The observations revealed kindness from people who had nothing to gain, but they also made Daniel realize that poverty had taught him something wealth never could: how to identify genuine humanity in a world that often disguised cruelty as friendship. The contrast between these working-class allies and Trevor's wealthy social circle became increasingly stark as Daniel observed both worlds during his 90-day limbo. But the distinction wasn't simply about money, it was about the relationship between resources and character. Trevor's friends were deeply in debt, maintaining lifestyles they couldn't afford, but they'd rather court financial ruin than admit vulnerability. Mrs. Chen lived modestly on her building manager salary, but she'd shared resources without expectation of acknowledgement or repayment. The difference suggested that poverty could cultivate either bitterness or compassion, but wealth seemed to consistently produce a specific kind of blindness where other people became either useful connections or irrelevant obstacles. Jennifer had attempted to contact Daniel twice during the observation period, but both instances revealed more about her psychology than about any residual feelings for their marriage. The first contact came on day 51, when she'd called from an unknown number asking if he still had the cast iron skillet from their wedding registry because she'd forgotten to take it and it matched the aesthetic of her new kitchen. Daniel had confirmed he still had it, but before he could offer to drop it off, she'd explained that Trevor would send someone to pick it up because she preferred not to interact directly, given their history. The casual cruelty of that conversation, treating a 12-year marriage as an inconvenient history preventing skillet retrieval, had crystallized something for Daniel about how completely Jennifer had rewritten their relationship in her mind to justify her choices. The second contact occurred on day 72, and the shift in tone suggested that reality was beginning to penetrate Jennifer's fantasy about her new life, but she was still far from understanding the full scope of her miscalculation. She'd sent an email, formal, emotionally distant, asking if Daniel could provide her with tax documents from their final married year, because Trevor's accountant needed them for some filing she didn't fully explain. The email's tone was bureaucratic rather than personal, but a sentence in the middle revealed stress creeping into her performance. "I hope you're doing well under the circumstances, and I want you to know that Trevor and I are very happy, despite some temporary financial complications that we're easily managing." The need to assert happiness to an ex-husband she claimed to have moved past suggested cracks in the foundation, but the defensive mention of temporary financial complications indicated she was beginning to glimpse truths Trevor had been hiding. Daniel had provided the tax documents through his new attorney rather than responding directly, but he'd instructed Catherine to include a brief personal note. "Jennifer, I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for. The documents are enclosed. Take care of yourself." The message was intentionally enigmatic, designed to spark curiosity without revealing knowledge, but Jennifer had responded within hours. "That's a strange thing to say. What do you mean, whatever I'm looking for? I've already found it." Daniel hadn't responded to that follow-up, but Catherine noted that Jennifer had sent 3 additional emails over the next 2 days, each more insistent that she was happy and Daniel needed to accept that and move on. The psychological projection in those messages, Jennifer telling Daniel to move on while she couldn't stop contacting him to affirm her choices, revealed a cognitive dissonance that would soon explode when reality could no longer be denied. Day 91 arrived on a Tuesday morning in late February when ice covered the streets and poverty felt like a physical weight pressing down on anyone without heated transportation. But Daniel had scheduled meetings that would transform that weight into a weapon. Catherine had prepared documents for the 90-day secrecy period's expiration, but the transition from hidden billionaire to public power wouldn't involve press conferences or social media announcements. It would be surgical, targeted, and designed for maximum educational impact on the specific people who'd earned it. The first action was scheduled for 9 a.m. when Westridge Financial's board of directors would convene for their quarterly meeting, but they'd discover that the building they'd leased for 17 years had been quietly purchased by Blackwell Properties International 3 days earlier. Trevor Banks would arrive at the office he'd occupied for 8 years to find his employee badge deactivated and a security team waiting with information that his employment was being terminated, effective immediately. But the termination wasn't coming from Westridge Financial. It was coming from the building's new owner, who'd inserted a clause into the purchase agreement requiring the removal of specific tenants engaged in financial impropriety. Daniel had structured the deal so that Trevor would be publicly escorted from the building in front of colleagues who'd believed his fabrications about wealth and success. But the humiliation was just the opening movement in a symphony of consequences. The second action occurred at 11 a.m. when Jennifer received a certified letter at the luxury apartment where she'd been living in carefully maintained delusion. But the letter came from building management explaining that the previous tenant, Trevor Banks, had failed to pay rent for 3 months and would be subject to immediate eviction proceedings. The letter explained that any personal property remaining in the unit after 5 p.m. would be disposed of according to state law, but a note at the bottom mentioned that the building's ownership had recently changed hands and the new owner had zero tolerance for tenants who misrepresent their financial capacity. Jennifer had called Trevor 17 times in the first hour after receiving that letter, but Trevor's phone had been confiscated by the security team escorting him from his office building, leaving her panicked to metastasize in isolation. The third action was more subtle, but strategically devastating. Daniel had Catherine's team contact every lender to whom Trevor owed money, offering to purchase the debt at a premium that made refusal financially irrational. But the acquisition consolidated Trevor's obligations to a single creditor who could now accelerate repayment demands or negotiate new terms. Trevor owed $847,000 to various sources, including the criminal lenders who charged interest rates that would make loan sharks blush. But Daniel now held that entire obligation and could choose whether to destroy Trevor financially or offer mercy that would come with conditions designed to teach rather than simply punish. Daniel had planned to observe Jennifer and Trevor's reactions from a distance through his security team's surveillance, but Jennifer had shown up at his apartment building at 3 p.m. that Tuesday, her appearance suggesting she'd dressed hastily and her emotional state indicating she'd progressed from confusion to panic to rage in the hours since receiving the eviction notice. Mrs. Chen had called Daniel's new private cell phone, the one only Catherine and his security team had, to warn him that his ex-wife was making a scene in the lobby. But Daniel had instructed her to allow Jennifer access because this confrontation had been inevitable from the moment he'd inherited power and couldn't be indefinitely postponed. Jennifer had pounded on his apartment door with an aggression that suggested she'd abandoned the sophisticated persona she'd been performing for Trevor's social circle. But when Daniel opened the door, she'd immediately launched into accusations. "Did you do this? Did you somehow get Trevor fired? The building is evicting us and Trevor's phone is off, and his company won't tell me anything, and I know you must have done something, because this can't be coincidence." Her appearance shocked Daniel despite his preparation. Her expensive clothes couldn't disguise the fear in her eyes, but the automatic assumption that Daniel had somehow caused her problems revealed she'd never truly believed he was as powerless as she'd claimed when justifying the divorce. Daniel had stepped aside to let her enter the apartment she'd once shared with him, But the space looked different now because he'd been gradually removing his belongings in preparation for a move he hadn't yet told anyone about. Jennifer's eyes had scanned the familiar poverty, the second-hand furniture, the cracked linoleum, the water stains on the ceiling, but her expression showed disgust competing with desperation. "I need you to tell me what you did," she demanded, her voice shaking. "Trevor said you couldn't possibly have connections to get him fired, but I remembered how you always knew things, how you always seemed to understand situations better than people thought, and I started wondering if maybe I'd underestimated you." Daniel had let the silence extend for a full 30 seconds, watching Jennifer's discomfort grow, but when he finally spoke, his voice carried a calmness that 12 years of marriage had never contained. "Jennifer, do you remember the last thing you said to me at the courthouse when the divorce was finalized?" She'd looked confused, clearly not remembering, but Daniel had memorized every word. "You said, 'I hope you find someone who can be satisfied with nothing, because that's all you'll ever have to offer.' Do you remember saying that?" Jennifer's face had shown recognition, but she'd immediately deflected. "I was angry and hurt, and you'd been such a disappointment for so long that I—" Daniel had raised his hand to stop her, the gesture somehow carrying authority that his maintenance worker persona had never projected. "I'm not asking you to apologize or take it back," he'd said. "I'm asking if you remember it, because I want you to understand that on the day you said that, I had just inherited a $450 billion real estate empire from a great uncle I'd never met. I signed those divorce papers as a poor maintenance worker, but I walked out of that courthouse as the wealthiest person you'll ever meet. And I said nothing because I wanted to see what you and Trevor would do when you thought you'd won." The color had drained from Jennifer's face so completely that Daniel had worried she might faint, but she'd grabbed the back of a kitchen chair to steady herself. "That's not possible," she'd whispered. "You're lying. You're trying to trick me, or—" Daniel had pulled out his phone and showed her the banking app Catherine had installed, displaying an account balance that looked less like money and more like a phone number for a distant galaxy. Jennifer's hands had started shaking as she'd stared at the numbers, but Daniel had swiped to show her property listings. The building where she and Trevor had been living, the office tower where Trevor had worked, the restaurant where they'd celebrated their wedding. "I own the building you've been living in," Daniel had explained with the patience of a teacher delivering a difficult lesson. "I own the building where Trevor worked. I'm the person who bought his debt from the criminal lenders he'd been hiding from you. And Jennifer, I've spent the last 90 days watching you celebrate escaping poverty while Trevor constructed a house of cards that was always going to collapse. But my involvement has simply accelerated the timeline and ensured that the collapse would be educational rather than merely tragic." Jennifer had collapsed into the kitchen chair, her expensive handbag falling to the floor, but her voice had emerged as barely a whisper. "Why would you do this? Why would you let me go through with the divorce if you knew you were about to be wealthy? We could have had everything. We could have traveled, bought a house, lived the life I'd always dreamed about." The selfishness of that response, the complete absence of acknowledgement that she'd betrayed him with his best friend, had confirmed everything Daniel needed to know about whether mercy was appropriate in her case. "You just answered your own question," Daniel had responded. "You didn't love me, Jennifer. You loved what you imagined wealth could give you, and when you thought I'd never have wealth, you found someone who could provide the illusion of it. You didn't leave me because we weren't compatible or because we'd grown apart. You left me because you met someone at a party who researched our marriage beforehand, calculated that destroying it would devastate me, and seduced you as part of a revenge plot against me for the crime of succeeding where he'd failed in college 20 years ago." Jennifer's face had shown confusion, then denial, then a dawning horror as pieces clicked into place. "Trevor researched us. You mean he knew who I was before we met?" Daniel had nodded, then played her a recording from the USB drive Catherine had given him, Trevor's voice at a bar 3 years ago talking to a friend. Daniel Matthews married way above his league. His wife is gorgeous and stuck in poverty because he has zero ambition. I'm going to show her what life could be with someone who actually wants success. And watching him lose her will be the sweetest revenge for him, making me look bad in Professor Richardson's class sophomore year. The recording had continued with Trevor explaining his systematic plan to befriend Jennifer at events, complain about his own fictional marriage problems to create common ground, and gradually position himself as a preferable alternative. But the cold calculation in his voice had made Jennifer's face crumble as she realized she'd been a weapon in someone else's revenge fantasy rather than a woman who'd fallen authentically in love. The recording ended with Trevor laughing. "The best part is, she'll think she chose me, but really I'm choosing to ruin his life, and she's just the tool I'm using to do it." Jennifer had started crying, deep, body-shaking sobs that suggested her entire self-conception was collapsing, but Daniel had felt a strange absence of satisfaction in her pain. The revenge he'd anticipated would feel triumphant instead felt hollow, but Harrison's journal had predicted this. When you finally defeat the people who hurt you, the victory will feel empty because you'll realize they were always smaller than the monuments you'd built to them in your imagination. True power comes from what you do with that emptiness, whether you fill it with further cruelty or with the wisdom to move forward. "Trevor never loved me," Jennifer had said through her tears, the realization clearly devastating her, beyond the loss of wealth or status. "I destroyed our marriage for a man who was using me to hurt you. I convinced myself you were the problem, that I deserved better, that I was making a brave choice to pursue happiness. But I was just... She couldn't finish the sentence, but Daniel completed it. "You were just being human, Jennifer. You were seduced by attention and the promise of an easier life, and you made choices that felt justified in the moment, but look different in retrospect. Trevor manipulated you, but you chose to be available for manipulation. Both things can be true." The conversation with Jennifer had extended past midnight, transitioning from confrontation to something resembling archaeology, excavating the ruins of their marriage to understand what had actually existed versus what they'd both imagined. But the honesty that emerged was only possible because wealth had removed the power dynamics that had defined their relationship. Jennifer had confessed things she'd never admitted during their marriage, that she'd resented Daniel's contentment with poverty because it suggested he didn't love her enough to want more, that she'd felt invisible at social gatherings when friends discussed vacations and renovations they couldn't afford, that she'd convinced herself Daniel was holding her back because accepting that their poverty was structural rather than personal required confronting systemic injustices she'd preferred to ignore. Daniel had shared his own truths, that he'd sometimes felt relief when she worked late because her disappointment in him had become a constant atmospheric pressure, that he'd known she was drifting away, but had convinced himself that loyalty alone could sustain a marriage, that he'd sometimes fantasized about her leaving, just so the anticipation of abandonment could end, and he could begin processing the loss he'd been mourning in advance for years. The admissions had been painful but clarifying, removing the protective fictions they'd both maintained about their marriage's final years, but the honesty also revealed that their problems had existed long before Trevor had weaponized them. "What are you going to do to us?" Jennifer had finally asked as the conversation exhausted itself into silence. "Are you going to destroy Trevor? Are you going to make me... I don't know what you can even do to me beyond what you've already done. I've lost the apartment, lost the life I thought I was building, lost my relationship because now I know it was fake, and I've lost the ability to tell myself that I made a brave choice instead of a selfish, stupid one." Daniel had considered his response carefully, aware that what he said next would determine whether this experience became educational or merely punitive. "Trevor is already destroyed. he'd explained. His career is finished because word spreads quickly about people who misrepresent their finances and get escorted from buildings by security. His debt is now held by a creditor who won't accept excuses or extensions. His social circle will evaporate when they realize his wealth was performance. But I'm going to offer him a choice. He can declare bankruptcy, lose everything, and start over with the permanent stain of financial failure. Or he can accept a job working in the maintenance department of one of my properties at minimum wage and slowly pay back what he owes while learning what poverty actually feels like. Jennifer had looked horrified. "That's cruel," she'd whispered, "making him work maintenance when he has an MBA and years of financial experience. That's designed to humiliate him." Daniel had nodded slowly. "Yes, it is designed to humiliate him, but it's also designed to educate him. Trevor has spent his entire adult life believing that poverty is a moral failure that happens to people too lazy or stupid to succeed. He's about to learn that poverty is a structural condition that has nothing to do with worth or work ethic, and that the people he's dismissed as beneath him are surviving challenges he never imagined. That's the education. The humiliation is just the tuition he's paying for it." "And what about me?" Jennifer had asked, her voice small. "What's my education?" Daniel had pulled out a folder Catherine had prepared, sliding it across the table between them. "You're going to work as the assistant manager at a property I own in Newark, a Section 8 housing complex where residents are primarily single mothers working multiple jobs to keep their children fed. Your salary will be $38,000 a year, which is approximately what I was earning when you decided it wasn't enough. You'll work there for 2 years while attending community college courses I'll pay for in social work or urban planning. At the end of 2 years, if you've completed your education and done the job well, I'll write you a recommendation letter that will get you hired anywhere you want to work. And I'll provide you with $200,000 to start your life over. If you refuse this offer, you'll receive nothing, and you'll navigate the job market as a retail manager with a 3-month employment gap and no references." Jennifer had stared at the folder's contents, the job description, the educational requirements, the terms of the offer, with an expression that cycled through emotions too quickly to identify. "You want me to work in a poor neighborhood for poor wages while going to school?" she'd asked, confusion evident in her voice. "That's my punishment." Daniel had shaken his head. "It's not punishment, it's an opportunity to develop empathy that you've never needed to cultivate. You spent 12 years married to poverty, but you never understood it because you saw it as a temporary condition that love would eventually overcome. Now you're going to live inside poverty without the fantasy of rescue. And you're going to meet people whose poverty is permanent, not because they're lazy or unintelligent, but because systems are designed to keep them exactly where they are. That's the education you need." The offer was more generous than Jennifer deserved, but Daniel had realized during their conversation that punishing her would only reinforce her victim narrative, whereas providing a structured path toward growth might actually transform her character. Harrison's journal had included a passage about mercy that had influenced Daniel's thinking. The weak punish to feel powerful. The powerful educate to create change. Revenge that doesn't transform the target is just masturbation, temporarily satisfying but ultimately meaningless. Jennifer had left Daniel's apartment at 1:30 a.m. with the folder clutched in her hands, her future now entirely dependent on whether pride would allow her to accept an offer that required acknowledging how completely she'd misjudged everything. Daniel had watched from his window as she'd walked to a bus stop, rather than calling a car service she could no longer afford, but the image of his ex-wife waiting in the cold for public transportation she'd once considered beneath her had generated unexpected sympathy. She'd been manipulated by Trevor, but she'd also been complicit in that manipulation because it gave her permission to pursue desires she'd been suppressing. Both truths would need to coexist if she was going to genuinely learn from this experience. Trevor's confrontation had been scheduled for the following morning, but unlike Jennifer, he'd received no advance warning and no private conversation. His education would begin with public humiliation because his betrayal had been public, calculated, and sustained over years. Daniel had arranged to meet Trevor at a coffee shop. Trevor had once mentioned was for people who've made it, but Trevor had arrived expecting to discuss business opportunities based on the vague message he'd received from an assistant claiming to represent potential investors. Trevor had looked diminished in ways that extended beyond his circumstances. His expensive suit couldn't disguise the fear in his eyes, but his posture still carried arrogance competing with desperation. He'd spotted Daniel sitting in a corner booth, and his expression had cycled through confusion, recognition, and then rage as he'd processed that his old friend was somehow involved in his current catastrophe. "What the hell are you doing here?" Trevor had demanded, his voice loud enough to draw attention from other patrons. "Did you have something to do with what's happening to me? Did you somehow get me fired?" Daniel had gestured to the seat across from him, but Trevor had remained standing, his hands clenched into fists. "I'm not sitting down with you," Trevor had snarled. "You're somehow behind this. I don't know how you did it, but I know you did. Jennifer showed up at 2 a.m. last night crying about how you're secretly a billionaire and you own everything and you've been watching us, but that's insane because you're a maintenance worker who can barely afford rent." The words had died as Daniel had placed documents on the table, property deeds, bank statements, photographs from Trevor's wedding to Jennifer, with a watermark indicating they'd been taken at a hotel Daniel owned. "Sit down, Trevor," Daniel had said quietly, his tone carrying authority that made the command impossible to ignore despite Trevor's anger. Trevor had sat, his face pale, as Daniel had methodically explained the inheritance, the surveillance, the documentation of the 3-year seduction plan, and the current situation where Trevor's entire financial existence was now controlled by the man he'd tried to destroy. "You researched Jennifer before you approached her," Daniel had said, sliding the transcript of Trevor's conversation from 3 years ago across the table. "You identified her as a vulnerability in my life, and you exploited that vulnerability as revenge for a perceived slight from college 20 years ago when I succeeded academically while you failed." Trevor had read the transcript with shaking hands, his face showing recognition that lying was impossible when confronted with his own recorded words. "I was drunk when I said that," he'd offered weakly. "I didn't mean it wasn't actually about revenge. I genuinely fell in love with her and—" Daniel had raised his hand to stop him. "Don't compound the betrayal with additional lies, Trevor. I have 3 years of documentation showing you systematically manipulated Jennifer while simultaneously destroying my reputation among our mutual friends. You didn't fall in love. You executed a plan, and that plan is now going to cost you everything you tried to build on its foundation." The color had drained from Trevor's face as Daniel had explained the debt consolidation, the job termination, and the choice being offered: bankruptcy and permanent financial ruin, or 2 years working maintenance at minimum wage while slowly repaying his obligations. "You can't be serious," Trevor had whispered. "You want me to work as a janitor? With my education and experience, that's humiliating and vindictive and—" Daniel had interrupted. "It's educational. You're going to learn what poverty actually feels like when it's not a temporary inconvenience between financial successes. You're going to understand that the people doing maintenance work aren't failures. They're people surviving in a system designed to extract their labor while denying them dignity. And you're going to discover whether your character can survive the same challenges you once judged me for not escaping." Trevor had tried multiple approaches: anger, bargaining, appeals to their former friendship, but each attempt had failed against Daniel's calm presentation of facts. "This isn't who you are," Trevor had finally said, desperation evident. The Daniel I knew wouldn't destroy someone like this. You're letting wealth corrupt you into becoming vindictive and cruel." Daniel had smiled without humor. "The Daniel you knew never existed, Trevor. You created a fiction of who I was to justify your own failures. And when that fiction succeeded despite your dismissiveness, you couldn't tolerate the cognitive dissonance. So you destroyed my marriage to prove to yourself that you were superior. But here's the truth. You were never competing with me. You were competing with your own insecurities, and you lost that competition the moment you decided destroying someone else would fill the emptiness where your own achievements should have been." The meeting had ended with Trevor walking away from the coffee shop, looking like a man whose entire self-conception had been dismantled, but Daniel had felt the same hollow victory he'd experienced with Jennifer. Harrison's journal had warned about this. You'll expect revenge to feel sweet, but it just tastes like ash because you realize the people who hurt you were never actually powerful. They were wounded creatures lashing out, and defeating them just proves you've become stronger than their damage. That's the moment you have to choose whether strength makes you cruel or wise. The following weeks blurred together as Daniel's new life began properly, moving from his apartment to a penthouse he'd purchased, but kept modest by billionaire standards, transitioning from maintenance worker to whatever role CEOs of vast empires occupied, and learning that wealth came with responsibilities that poverty had never required him to consider. Catherine had assembled a team of advisors who treated him with deference he hadn't earned, but which his net worth apparently mandated. But Daniel had insisted on certain conditions that his advisors found eccentric. He wanted to personally interview every building manager in his properties. He wanted to establish scholarships for people aging out of foster care. And he wanted to create a foundation funding financial literacy education in poor neighborhoods. Jennifer had accepted the Newark position after 3 days of consideration, but her first day had generated a phone call where she'd cried describing the difference between her expectations and reality. "These people are working so hard," she'd said, her voice shaking. "There's a woman on the 3rd floor who works 3 jobs and still can't afford her daughter's medication. Another resident just got evicted from her previous place because the landlord raised rent by 40% with 30 days' notice. And I realized this was almost me. If you hadn't made this offer, this would have been my life, and I would have deserved it for every time I complained about our apartment or said I was suffering when I had no idea what actual suffering looked like." The education was working, but Daniel had realized it was also transforming him. Showing him poverty from a position of power revealed structural cruelties he'd accepted as natural when he'd been surviving them himself. The building in Newark where Jennifer worked had maintenance issues the previous ownership had ignored for years, but Daniel had allocated $3 million for renovations that would make the apartments actually livable rather than merely legal. The residents had been suspicious of the improvements initially, expecting gentrification and displacement, but Daniel had guaranteed 20-year leases at current rates, with annual increases tied to inflation rather than market rates. The gratitude those residents showed had felt more valuable than any amount of money could purchase, but it had also filled him with rage that this basic decency was considered exceptional rather than standard. Trevor had started his maintenance position at a commercial building in downtown Chicago, but the reports Daniel received suggested the education was more complicated than intended. Trevor's supervisor had noted that he worked diligently but avoided interacting with other staff, maintaining distance that suggested he still considered the work beneath him despite his circumstances. 2 months into the job, Trevor had requested a meeting with Daniel, claiming he had important information that required discussion, but Daniel had agreed to meet primarily out of curiosity about whether Trevor had learned anything or simply become more entrenched in resentment. They'd met at the same coffee shop where Daniel had delivered Trevor's initial consequences, but Trevor's appearance had changed significantly. His expensive clothes had been replaced with practical work attire. His grooming suggested limited time and resources, and his bearing showed a humility that might have been genuine or might have been performance. "I wanted to apologize," Trevor had begun, his voice careful. "Not because I think it will change your mind about my situation, but because I've spent 2 months doing the work you used to do, and I finally understand how completely I misjudged everything." Daniel had remained silent, allowing Trevor space to continue. "When I was working at Westridge, I thought poverty was about choices, that people who were poor had simply made bad decisions or weren't working hard enough. But I'm working harder now than I ever worked in finance, and I'm barely surviving. I can't afford car repairs, so I take the bus, which means I leave home at 5 a.m. to make my 7 a.m. shift. I can't afford my old apartment, so I'm renting a room from a woman who has 3 other tenants and 1 bathroom. I eat ramen and bologna sandwiches because anything else exhausts my food budget. And I realized this was your life when you were married to Jennifer. This was what you were dealing with every day while I was seducing your wife and convincing her you weren't good enough." The admission had sounded genuine, but Daniel had learned to be skeptical of performances. "Why are you telling me this?" he'd asked. "Are you hoping for mercy, or has something actually changed in how you understand the world?" Trevor had looked down at his hands, which showed calluses that hadn't existed during his financial career. "Maybe both," he'd admitted. "I'm hoping for mercy because this is brutally hard, and I'm not sure I can survive 2 years of it without breaking. But also something has changed. I worked with a guy last week, Luis, who's been doing maintenance for 17 years. He has 2 kids in college that he's putting through school on a maintenance salary. He works 2 jobs, sleeps 4 hours a night, and I've never heard him complain once. And I realized I'd built my entire identity on looking down on people like Luis, on believing my MBA made me superior, when the truth is Luis has more character in his calloused hands than I've developed in my entire life." Daniel had ordered them both coffee while considering his response, but the truth was he'd already decided weeks earlier that mercy would be more transformative than sustained punishment. "I'm going to make you an offer," he'd said finally. "You can continue the maintenance work for 6 more months, or you can accept a different position I'm creating, Director of Financial Education for a foundation I'm establishing. The salary will be $75,000 a year, which is enough to live modestly but not lavishly. Your job will be developing programs teaching financial literacy to people in working-class neighborhoods, and you'll be required to work directly with the communities you serve rather than directing from a distance. Your debt will be forgiven, but if you accept this position, you'll be prohibited from working in traditional finance for 10 years. You'll spend the next decade teaching people how to avoid the predatory systems you once profited from." Trevor's face had shown shock, then something that might have been hope. But Daniel had raised a hand to prevent premature gratitude. "This offer comes with a condition. You have to publicly acknowledge what you did to Jennifer and me, not in a press conference or social media post, but in a video that will be shown to every person who participates in the financial literacy programs. You'll explain how you manipulated Jennifer as revenge against me, how you accumulated debt to maintain appearances, and how your own financial irresponsibility nearly destroyed you. You'll become a cautionary tale, and every time someone in one of our programs makes better financial decisions because they learned from your mistakes, you'll have to live with knowing your redemption is built on the foundation of your failures being used as negative examples." The condition had been designed to ensure Trevor's education continued even after formal consequences ended, but the look on Trevor's face suggested the ongoing humiliation of that arrangement might be harder than the maintenance work. "I'll do it," he'd said after a long pause. "Not because it's comfortable, but because it's what I deserve. And because maybe if my mistakes help other people avoid similar ones, then something good can come from how badly I've screwed up." The acceptance had sounded genuine, but Daniel knew only time would reveal whether Trevor's transformation was real or just another performance by a man skilled at telling people what they wanted to hear. 2 years after inheriting Harrison Blackwell's empire, Daniel sat in the office of his Manhattan headquarters, reviewing reports on the various programs he'd established. But the numbers documenting lives changed felt more significant than the financial statements documenting wealth accumulated. The Newark housing complex where Jennifer worked had become a model for affordable housing that maintained dignity rather than just meeting minimum legal standards. But the waiting list for apartments had grown to over 2,000 families because nowhere else offered security combined with respect. Jennifer herself had completed her associate's degree in social work and was now pursuing her bachelor's while managing a staff of 15 at the complex. But her transformation had extended beyond professional development to fundamental character change that she'd documented in a journal Daniel had asked her to keep. An entry from month 18 had captured the shift. I spent 12 years married to Daniel believing I understood poverty, but I was just a tourist visiting it temporarily while always believing escape was possible. Now I work with women who will never escape, not because they're not trying, but because the systems are designed to keep them exactly where they are. And I realized Daniel wasn't failing me during our marriage. He was surviving a structural assault. I refused to acknowledge because admitting it meant confronting that I'd been complicit in systems that benefited me while crushing others. I left him because I thought he was the problem, but he was actually the person showing me what dignity looks like when everything else has been stripped away. Trevor's financial literacy programs had reached over 50,000 people in the first 2 years, but the video of his confession had generated unexpected controversy. Some viewers saw it as genuine accountability, while others viewed it as a billionaire's pet project humiliating a former rival. Trevor himself had told Daniel during one of their quarterly check-ins that the ongoing confrontation with his mistakes was more painful than I'd imagined, but more necessary than I'd understood. The programs had documented significant improvements in participants' financial stability, but Trevor had also started receiving letters from people thanking him for his honesty, sharing their own stories of debt, manipulation, and the desperate performances people enacted to hide poverty from friends and family. The letters had been compiled into a book Trevor was writing called The Price of Pretending, but the royalties were being donated to the foundation rather than enriching the author. Daniel's relationship with both Jennifer and Trevor had settled into something neither friendship nor forgiveness, but rather a complicated coexistence marked by mutual recognition of shared history and divergent futures. Jennifer had started dating one of the community organizers working in Newark, a man named David whose salary was modest but whose character was solid, and she'd asked Daniel's permission before moving forward with the relationship, an unnecessary request that revealed she still processed him as someone whose approval mattered. Daniel had blessed the relationship while reminding her that his opinion was irrelevant to her choices, but privately he'd felt relief that she'd found someone whose values aligned with who she'd become rather than who she'd been. The $450 billion empire Harrison had built continued generating wealth Daniel couldn't meaningfully spend, but the resources had enabled projects that poverty would have kept perpetually theoretical. He'd purchased 14 buildings in his old neighborhood and converted them into affordable housing with social services integrated into the structures: childcare, job training, mental health services, and legal aid, all available without residents needing to navigate complex bureaucracies. Mrs. Chen, his former building manager, now oversaw the entire network of properties with a staff of 47, but she'd initially resisted the promotion because she didn't have the education for management. Daniel had reminded her that she'd been managing a building and its residents for 12 years while treating people with dignity, regardless of their ability to pay rent on time. And that education was just paper certifying skills she'd already demonstrated daily. Harrison's journals had become Daniel's constant companion, but reading them with 2 years of wealth experience revealed layers he'd missed initially. The most profound entry, written 6 months before Harrison's death, had been marked with 3 red tabs. Daniel, if you're reading this, you've now experienced both sides of the economic divide, and you understand what most wealthy people never learn, that poverty and wealth are primarily about power rather than money. Poor people aren't lacking resources. They're lacking power to access resources that exist abundantly. Wealthy people aren't smarter or harder working. They're positioned in systems that convert their efforts into compounding advantages while converting poor people's efforts into subsistence survival. Your inheritance wasn't just money, it was the power to restructure those systems for people who will never have the power to restructure them themselves. What you do with that power determines whether you become another rich fool hoarding dragons' treasure while villages starve, or whether you become someone whose wealth generates dignity for people who've been systematically denied it. The responsibility of that mission had become the organizing principle of Daniel's life, but it had also generated unexpected complications with other wealthy people who viewed his approach as threatening their own positions. He'd been uninvited from charity galas where his questions about why Band-Aid solutions were preferred over structural changes had made donors uncomfortable, but he'd also been sought out by younger billionaires who'd inherited wealth and wanted guidance on wielding it ethically. The meetings with that second group had generated a network of what they'd informally called the guilty heirs, people who recognized their wealth as primarily circumstantial and wanted to deploy it systematically rather than charitably. Jennifer had asked Daniel once during a meeting about the Newark property whether he regretted how everything had unfolded. Would you prefer to have stayed poor but stayed married, or are you glad the betrayal happened because it led to discovering the inheritance? The question had been genuine rather than manipulative, but Daniel had needed several days to formulate an honest answer. I wish I'd never had to learn that you and Trevor were capable of that betrayal, but I'm glad I learned it while I still had time to become someone different than who I would have been if I'd died poor and loyal to people who didn't deserve that loyalty. The inheritance didn't make me happy. Wealth doesn't generate happiness, but it gave me power to effect changes that poverty would have kept theoretical. So I'm glad for the resources, but sad about the path that led to them. Both things coexist uncomfortably. The most unexpected consequence of Daniel's transformation had been his relationship with loneliness. Wealth had generated attention from people who wanted access to resources, but genuine connection had become more difficult because he could never be certain whether people valued him or his money. He'd dated occasionally, but always felt the specter of his net worth hovering over interactions, making authentic intimacy nearly impossible. Catherine had told him this was common among the extremely wealthy, but she'd also noted that people who'd experienced both poverty and wealth often found connection with others who'd traveled similar paths, people who understood that money changed circumstances, but not the underlying human need for relationships, where vulnerability was possible without risk of exploitation. That observation had led Daniel to seek out others who'd gone from poverty to wealth rather than inheriting it generationally. But the conversations with that group revealed a consistent pattern. Most had found themselves isolated in ways their poverty-era selves hadn't been, because wealth created distance that was hard to bridge. A tech entrepreneur who'd grown up in Section 8 housing had told Daniel, "When I was poor, I had 12 close friends because we were surviving together. Now I have thousands of contacts, but maybe 2 people I'd call if I was genuinely struggling, because wealth makes people treat you differently, even when you're trying to stay the same person." Daniel had asked Jennifer, during one of their quarterly reviews of her progress, whether she ever missed him, not their marriage specifically, but him as the person he'd been before wealth. She'd thought carefully before responding. "I miss the simplicity of when I believed poverty was our only problem, and love could solve it. I don't miss who I was then. That Jennifer was selfish and short-sighted and cruel in ways I'm still discovering. But I miss the version of you who believed people were fundamentally good, despite all evidence suggesting otherwise. Wealth hasn't made you cynical exactly, but it's made you suspicious in ways that probably help you avoid being exploited, but also prevent you from being surprised by kindness. That's sad, even though it's probably necessary. The observation had bothered Daniel because it was accurate. He'd developed sophisticated systems for evaluating whether people approaching him had genuine interest or financial motives, but those systems prevented the kind of spontaneous trust that poverty had paradoxically enabled. When everyone knew you had nothing, their interest had to be personal rather than transactional. When everyone knew you had everything, every interaction carried the shadow of calculation. The 5-year anniversary of Daniel's inheritance arrived on a cold December morning, but the milestone brought unexpected news. Trevor had suffered a heart attack while teaching a financial literacy seminar and had died before the ambulance arrived. The shock of that loss had hit Daniel harder than he'd anticipated, not because he and Trevor had rebuilt their friendship, but because death had terminated the educational arc before its completion. Trevor had been 47 years old, apparently healthy, but the autopsy revealed stress-related cardiac damage that the medical examiner attributed to prolonged psychological and physical strain. The funeral had been small. Trevor's social circle from his Westridge financial days had evaporated after his fall, but the attendees included dozens of people from the financial literacy programs who'd traveled significant distances to honor a teacher who'd been honest about his failures. Jennifer had delivered a eulogy that acknowledged Trevor's betrayal while also recognizing his genuine transformation in his final years. But her words had generated controversy among attendees who believed some actions were unforgivable, regardless of subsequent redemption. Daniel had listened to those arguments during the reception after the service, but he'd found himself defending Trevor's memory because the man who'd died teaching financial literacy to poor communities had been genuinely different from the man who'd seduced Jennifer as revenge against a perceived slight. A letter arrived 3 days after the funeral, delivered by Trevor's attorney but written months earlier, with instructions to provide it to Daniel in the event of my death or on the completion of our original 2-year agreement, whichever comes first. The letter's contents revealed that Trevor had understood more about Daniel's motivations than he'd let on during their quarterly meetings. Daniel, by the time you read this, either I'm dead or I've completed the work you assigned as consequence for my betrayal. Either way, I wanted you to know that I finally understand what you were teaching me, but I also understand what you were teaching yourself. You gave me work that forced me to confront poverty as a participant rather than an observer, but you also created a situation where my redemption required ongoing public humiliation. I think you did this because you're still figuring out whether mercy or justice is more important, and whether power should be used to punish or transform. I don't know which answer you've found, but I know what I learned. Mercy and justice aren't opposites. They're complementary tools that serve different purposes depending on whether the goal is teaching or punishment. You showed me mercy by not destroying me completely, but you insisted on justice by requiring me to live with ongoing consequences of my choices. Both were necessary, and both transformed me in ways that pure mercy or pure justice couldn't have achieved alone. If I'm dead when you read this, please know that I died grateful for consequences I initially resented. You could have crushed me and felt justified doing so, but instead you created a path where my failures became educational tools that helped thousands of people avoid similar mistakes. That's a kind of redemption I didn't deserve, but that you offered anyway, and it changed my entire understanding of what wealthy people owe to communities they have power to affect. If you ever marry again, Choose someone who sees your character rather than your circumstances. Jennifer saw your circumstances and left when she thought they'd never improve. Your next partner should see who you are regardless of what you have, because that's the only way wealth won't poison the relationship. I know this is advice from someone who destroyed your marriage, which makes it absurd for me to be offering it, but maybe that's exactly why you should listen. I know precisely how relationships fail when circumstances matter more than character. Trevor. The letter had generated a grief Daniel hadn't experienced at the funeral itself, because it revealed that Trevor's transformation had been genuine rather than performative. The cynical part of Daniel wondered whether Trevor had written the letter specifically to generate this response, but Catherine had pointed out that Trevor had written it during month 7 of his maintenance work, long before mercy had been offered, suggesting the insights had been authentic rather than calculated to manipulate. Jennifer had requested a meeting after Trevor's death, appearing at Daniel's office without appointment, but with a folder of documents she'd apparently been preparing for months. "I need to show you something," she'd said, her demeanor professional but with an undercurrent of emotion she was working to suppress. The folder contained a proposal for expanding the Newark housing model to 12 additional cities, complete with cost analyses, staffing projections, and letters of support from community organizations, but the cover page included a dedication. "In memory of Trevor Banks, who taught me that transformation is possible, but also that some damage can't be undone, and to Daniel Matthews, who showed me that power is most meaningful when it's used to redistribute dignity." The proposal was sophisticated, professionally prepared, and financially sound, but Daniel had focused on Jennifer's face while reading it. She'd been crying while putting this together, he realized, processing Trevor's death through productive action rather than passive grief. "This is excellent work," he'd said finally, "but why bring it to me now? Why not wait until you'd finished grieving?" Jennifer had smiled without humor. "Because grief is work I do by continuing the education Trevor and I both received. He died teaching financial literacy, and I'm living by teaching myself and others that poverty isn't a personal failing. Stopping that work to grieve would dishonor what he became, even if it can't erase what he did." Daniel had approved the expansion project immediately, but he'd also made Jennifer a partner in the decision-making, rather than just an employee implementing his vision. She'd become one of the people whose opinion he trusted, to see past the seductive simplicity of charity toward the complicated difficulty of structural change, and that trust felt like a kind of family he'd constructed to replace the biological family he'd never had, and the marital family that had betrayed and then transformed itself. The 5 years since inheriting Harrison's empire had generated changes Daniel couldn't have imagined during his maintenance worker days, but the most significant transformation hadn't been his circumstances. It had been his understanding of what circumstances meant. Poverty hadn't been a character test he'd passed through moral superiority. It had been a structural condition he'd survived through a combination of luck, endurance, and ultimately an inheritance that most people trapped in poverty would never receive. Wealth hadn't made him better or smarter. It had given him power that poverty had denied, and the question of how to wield that power ethically had become the central concern of his existence. Harrison's journal entries continued providing guidance even 5 years after his death, but Daniel had started writing his own journal entries addressed to future inheritors of the empire he was building. One entry, written on the anniversary of his first meeting with Catherine Whitmore, attempted to articulate lessons he'd learned. "Whoever inherits this wealth after I'm gone, understand that what you're receiving isn't just money. It's power to affect systems that either trap or liberate millions of people who will never have power to affect those systems themselves. That power comes with the responsibility to remember that poverty isn't a personal failing and wealth isn't a personal achievement. They're primarily structural positions that people occupy based on circumstances mostly beyond their control. Use this wealth to redistribute dignity, not just resources. Poor people don't need charity. They need systems that allow their labor to generate security instead of just survival. Build housing that treats residents as valuable rather than problems to be warehoused. Create jobs that offer dignity along with paychecks. Fund education that develops critical thinking rather than just job training. And always remember that the people you're serving understand their own needs better than you understand those needs for them. So listen to communities before deciding what help looks like. Never let wealth make you forget what poverty felt like. I keep my old work uniform in my closet and occasionally put it on to remember the person I was before money gave me power. That practice keeps me from developing the casual cruelty toward poor people that wealthy people often exhibit without realizing it. The assumption that poverty is a choice, that if people just worked harder or made better decisions, they could escape it. Finally, understand that you can't solve poverty through individual action. You can only create examples of what's possible when resources are deployed ethically rather than extracted efficiently. The real work is political, structural, and systemic. Your wealth gives you power to fund that work, but the work itself must be done by and with the communities affected, not imposed on them by wealthy benefactors who think they know better. Jennifer stood on the roof of the Newark housing complex, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and purple, but her attention was focused on the children playing in the courtyard below. Kids whose parents worked multiple jobs, but who still had access to after-school programs that Daniel's foundation funded. 10 years had passed since the divorce that had seemed like her escape from mediocrity, but which had actually been her descent into facing truths she'd spent her adult life avoiding. But the decade had transformed her into someone who might finally deserve the surname she'd abandoned. Matthews had implied stability she'd rejected, but the work she'd been doing honored what that name had actually represented. Trevor's death had hit her harder than she'd expected, not because she'd loved him. That illusion had shattered the moment she'd heard the recording of him describing her as a tool in his revenge plot, but because his transformation had given her hope that her own could be genuine rather than performed. The financial literacy foundation Trevor had built before his death now served over 200,000 people annually across 15 cities, but the program still showed that video of Trevor's confession as an introduction to understanding how desperation and pride combined to generate destructive financial decisions. Daniel had become someone Jennifer read about in business publications, more often than someone she saw in person, but their quarterly meetings continued because she'd proven herself capable of managing significant aspects of his affordable housing empire. She'd never remarried, partly because she wasn't sure she trusted her own judgment about partners, but also because the work she was doing felt more meaningful than any relationship she could imagine. David, the community organizer she'd dated briefly, had moved to Philadelphia for a new position, but they'd remained friends in a way that suggested some connections were meant to be supportive rather than romantic. Mrs. Chen had retired 2 years earlier at 73 years old, but she'd fought the retirement until Daniel had explained that her job was secure and her pension was guaranteed, and that retirement didn't mean abandoning the residents. It just meant transitioning from managing their housing to mentoring the person taking over that management. The retirement party had filled the entire community room of the original building where Daniel had worked maintenance, but the speeches from residents had revealed the profound impact of treating people with dignity, regardless of their ability to pay rent on time. Mrs. Chen had cried through most of those speeches, but her tears had been pride rather than sadness, because she'd devoted 40 years to work that people had noticed and appreciated. Daniel himself had become increasingly reclusive as his wealth had grown, not because he'd developed the isolation that often accompanied extreme wealth, but because he'd deliberately chosen to limit his public presence to focus on the structural work that press conferences and galas distracted from. He'd married a woman named Dr. Aisha Williams, a sociologist who'd grown up in poverty and who'd spent her career studying how wealth perpetuated itself across generations while poverty became hereditary, and their partnership had generated research that was changing how policymakers thought about affordable housing, education funding, and economic mobility. The $450 billion Harrison had left, Daniel had grown to over $800 billion through careful management. But Daniel had also given away over $300 billion through the foundation and various projects designed to redistribute power rather than just resources. The giving had generated criticism from some wealthy people, who viewed it as threatening the systems that maintained their own positions. But it had also inspired other billionaires to approach wealth as a responsibility to be deployed, rather than a competition to be won. On the 15th anniversary of his inheritance, Daniel had returned to the apartment building where he'd worked maintenance, but the building had been renovated. Beyond recognition, where there'd been water damage and broken fixtures, there were now modern apartments with efficient heating, reliable plumbing, and a community room that served as a hub for resident services. The current maintenance worker, a young man named Marcus, who'd aged out of foster care 3 years earlier, had recognized Daniel from photographs and had approached him shyly to say thank you. "Thank you for what?" Daniel had asked, genuinely confused about what a 23-year-old maintenance worker could be thanking him for. Marcus had explained that the foster care scholarship program Daniel's foundation offered had allowed him to attend community college while working, and that the job placement services had connected him with the maintenance position that paid enough to support himself while completing his education. "I'm going to be an HVAC technician," Marcus had said with visible pride. "The training program starts next month, and when I finish, I'll make enough money that I won't have to choose between rent and food." The conversation with Marcus had crystallized something for Daniel about what Harrison had been trying to teach him 15 years earlier. Wealth's value wasn't in what it purchased for the person who held it, but in what it enabled for people who'd never have access to it. Harrison had watched Daniel struggle through poverty for 37 years, not out of cruelty, but because he'd wanted Daniel to understand structurally what people experienced systemically, so that when power finally arrived, it would be wielded by someone who remembered what powerlessness felt like. Jennifer had joined Daniel for that 15-year anniversary visit, and afterward they'd walked through the neighborhood where they'd once lived together in poverty. The walk had been quiet initially, but Jennifer had eventually broken the silence. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't divorced you, if I'd stayed and we'd inherited all of this together?" Daniel had considered the question carefully before responding. "I think we would have destroyed each other. Not because either of us was bad, but because our marriage was built on a foundation of me needing to be saved and you needing to be the hero who saved me. That dynamic couldn't have survived wealth because it would have removed the problem our relationship was organized around solving." Jennifer had nodded slowly, accepting the truth of that assessment. "I've spent 15 years atoning for betraying you," she'd said quietly. "But I've realized recently that what I'm actually atoning for is betraying myself, for believing that circumstances mattered more than character, and that leaving you for someone wealthier made me brave rather than cruel. I can't undo that, but I can spend the rest of my life living differently." They'd parted ways at the bus stop where Daniel had once waited in the cold for transportation he could barely afford, but now he was being picked up by a driver while Jennifer took public transportation by choice rather than necessity. The role reversal felt somehow appropriate. Wealth had given Daniel options but hadn't changed who he fundamentally was, while consequence had transformed Jennifer from someone who judged people by their economic position into someone who understood that position was primarily circumstantial rather than earned. The story of the poor, abandoned husband who'd inherited $450 billion and used it to educate the people who'd betrayed him had become something of an urban legend in certain circles, but the retelling had stripped away the complexity and reduced it to a simple revenge narrative. The reality had been messier. Betrayal had been genuine, but so had transformation. Punishment had been deserved, but mercy had been necessary, and power had enabled change, but hadn't simplified moral questions about how power should be wielded. Harrison Blackwell's final journal entry, which Daniel had only discovered years after receiving the initial inheritance, had summed up the entire philosophy. Daniel, by the time you find this entry, you'll have spent years trying to figure out how to use wealth ethically. I hope you've learned what took me 70 years to understand, that wealth is primarily a tool for redistributing power, and the question isn't whether you should redistribute it, but whether you do so in ways that generate dignity or dependency. Give people power to change their circumstances, rather than giving them changed circumstances, while leaving them powerless. That's the only wealth that actually matters. 20 years after that day in the courthouse, when Jennifer had laughed while clutching Trevor's arm, and Daniel had signed away a marriage he'd thought defined his identity, the three of them, Daniel, Jennifer, and Trevor's memory, had become case studies in transformation, consequence, and the complicated relationship between power and character. Trevor was gone, but his work continued. Jennifer had become the person she'd failed to be during their marriage, and Daniel had learned that inheriting $450 billion was the easy part. Deciding what kind of person that inheritance would transform him into was the work that would occupy the rest of his life. The abandoned husband had been saved by wealth he'd never sought, but the salvation hadn't come from the money. It had come from the choice to use that money in ways that honored the struggles of his poverty, while acknowledging the responsibilities of his power. Whether that made him a good person was debatable, but it made him someone trying to be good, which Harrison's journals suggested was the most anyone could honestly aspire to be.